Hi. I wanted to take this opportunity tonight to vent a little. I was having kind of a rant at dinner tonight with my husband, and I thought, I think I'm going to do something different and put this out on video instead of the usual blog that I put out. Um, Basically, my rant was around some legislation that is currently being is moving through the Iowa legislature. As a little background around me, I have been an educator for more than 30 years, and all but one of those years has been in Iowa. I started out as a behavior disorder teacher, is what we called it then, in Burlington and in Des Moines, and also in Columbus, Ohio. And then I was also a behavior interventionist in Des Moines. I've been a building principal. I have been a secondary ed services director. I have been a special ed director. I've been an AEA special ed director, and I currently am special ed director for a large urban district. Um, Again, I wanted to talk about some legislation that has been um, in the legislature or in negotiation this spring. I honestly thought that it was going to go away with COVID, and it didn't. It's still here. And in fact, it just made it through what's called the funnel this week, which means that it's still live, and it appears that it's legislation that's going to get approved. The legislation is Senate File 2360, and it's also known as the Room Clear Bill. Okay, so there are basically three components of this bill. The first main components. The first one happens to be about the creation of therapeutic classrooms. So these would be classrooms where students with significant behavior concerns would, in theory, get some very specialized kind of treatment. Um, they would be segregated classrooms. They would be away from the public school. Uh, One thing that's kind of interesting about that idea is that the funding for this is maxed out at 1.5 million for the state, and then the funding is going to be 1.5 times what you would get for a student, a regular ed student. This would be so far below what you would need to run a program like this. To run an effective kind of therapeutic classroom or a classroom for students with significant behavior, it can be anywhere from $150 a day to $500 a day for a student. This reimbursement would be about $52 a day. So the whole thinking there is just kind of silly. Um, the other thing is a thing called room clears, and for those of you who are not in the education world, a room clear means a student is a danger to themselves or others, having a particularly bad time in the classroom, and other kids are at risk, and so what happens is that student that's acting out remains in the classroom, and the rest of the students are removed. And I think the major thing about this is that room clears have not been used in the way that I believe they should have been. What happens is teachers get frustrated because they're having to remove their class multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day, and I completely agree that's not appropriate. That's not appropriate for anyone that's involved, right? I remember when I was a special ed director at a district, and one of the first things that I had to deal with was, go to this elementary school. There's a situation there, people are upset. So happened to be a student that was in the evaluation process, but it was a first grade classroom. When I got there, the teacher, excellent teacher, who was in tears, it was 11 o'clock in the morning, they'd done 6 room clears that morning for the same student. The student, when I got there, was kind of destroying the classroom, ripping things up, knocking things over, throwing things around. And then there was folks there that were part of the evaluation process that had their clipboards out, and we're taking data. And I said, yeah, this isn't okay for anybody. This isn't the student who's acting out isn't in a learning environment. The kids that are being removed multiple times, their learning's disrupted. The teachers disrupted, and so that was not an appropriate place to do that evaluation under those circumstances. But I don't know why we need legislation for that, because I think that's more of a professional learning thing for administrators, and for administrators even realizing that they can step in and make that decision. I teach a class called What Every Administrator Needs to Know About Special Education, and that's one of the things we cover, is that their purview is the entire building and the safety of the entire building, and that sometimes they need to have a loud voice, and sometimes they need to be more directive around things, and that they're the person to do that. So I don't see the reason why this legislation is necessary for that kind of result. The third thing that is addressed is when teachers can put their hands on students. This is part of the bill that's evolved, because the original language in it had to do, said that teachers could put their hands on students. I believe it said something like passively resisting, right? Which it doesn't quite say that now. It does lean more towards a danger to themselves and others, and that's already covered in Chapter 103 in Iowa law. So, in having more conversations with teachers and other folks, and they were hearing stories that teachers were feeling like they were following the law, they were reasonable, they put their hands on a student, and then they were disciplined by administration. And again, to me, that's a completely different scenario. If you're having an administrator who is disciplining teachers for following the law and acting reasonably, this law is not going to stop whatever problem there is there. If that's the situation, then that's probably happening in other arenas, and we don't need a law for children to stop that from happening. I don't think that teachers want to put their hands on students more. This is not something that I hear from teachers. I don't think that they're coming back to school saying things would be a lot better if when students act out, I can physically intervene with them in a different way than I currently already could, meaning that they're a danger to themselves or others. I've done this again 30 plus years, worked in a lot of the time with students who do become aggressive, and I will tell you that when you put your hands on a student who is agitated and threatening, things don't calm down. I'm sure other folks that have done this work would say the exact same thing. You do it for safety reasons, and when you put your hands on a student who is agitated, things will most likely get worse before they get better. The student's safety is at risk. The staff person's safety is at risk. This is not something that the people want to be doing more of. I think what teachers want is they want students to behave better in their classrooms. They want they want to be in a situation where they feel unsafe. So they are supportive of things that will help a student to behave better. They want more mental health supports. They want more behavior supports, effective behavior supports in their building. They want professional learning that is meaningful for them and effective for them, that will help to give them more skills to work with students that struggle. And for their students, I've had so many conversations with teachers who, what they want for their students, and and particularly students who are struggling with behavior is that they want them to have access to health care. They want them to have decent housing, and they want them to live in a in a safe home, and they want them to have the academic interventions that they need. They want their students to have hope, and I don't hear teachers saying to me that what I really want to do is be able to restrain that student. That's not what I hear. Um, for this next piece, I know that I'm going to say some things that are going to make some of you mad, maybe all of you mad. I don't know, and I'm okay with that. You know, again, 56 years old, 30 plus years in the business, and a lot of it as an administrator. And one thing I've realized is if nobody's mad, nothing changes. You know, we are in a situation in our country, in our society, in our state, in our culture where people are speaking out more. People are saying the things that they haven't ever said before. That things have gotten to a point where people are willing to take the risk to say something that might be unpopular. So I'm going to say some things here that I'm okay with. I actually appreciate pushback, so feel free to reach out to me. I believe this bill is a racist bill. I think it's a frightening example of why I don't trust that real change will happen. I want to be transparent right now, maybe a little vulnerable, which makes me uncomfortable, but I want you to think about the student that this legislation is really talking about, right? So we're talking about, a student who's lost control, right? Whether they're throwing things around the classroom, and they're making threats, they're damaging property, they might be hurting themselves, whatever situation they're in. It's a very disruptive situation that makes people in the classroom feel unsafe. And when I close my eyes and I picture that situation in my mind, the student is black. That's what I see. And I think if we were totally honest, a lot of you would probably say the same thing. That is that implicit bias that we go to, that when we think about students with these kind of issues, that immediately we think of a black student. It's not only in our minds, it manifests itself into practice, and it manifests itself into the results. So I'm going to share some things, some data that I think backs up what I just said. So this is some civil rights data, okay? Black children represent 18% of enrollment in pre-K, so this is preschool, and represent 48% of students who are suspended more than one time. So first of all, we're suspending students in this country in preschool, and half of those students are black. Black students in K-12 are suspended at a rate 3 times higher than white students. Black students represent 16% of K-12 students in this country, but represent 20% of students referred to law enforcement and 31% of the students arrested for something school-related. Black children represent 19% of students with disabilities, but represent 36% of students with disabilities who have been physically restrained. In Iowa, 21% of black male students have been suspended versus 4% of white students. And in Iowa, 12% of black female students have been suspended versus 2% of white students. That That last statistic I gave was black male students. Not sure if I said that. So in Iowa, 21% of black male students have been suspended versus 4% of white students. So this is the whole deal right now, right? We're talking about legislation around physical restraint. We're talking about statistics that already show that black students are physically restrained at a higher level than white students. And we don't even know the non-special ed students because that data has yet to be gathered. George Floyd was murdered during a restraint. He was murdered during a restraint. I mean, you think of all the conversation and advocacy and action and activity around this issue right now. And at the same time that we're doing that, we have bipartisan support for a bill like this going through our legislature. I find it unfathomable. So if I'm a black student and I'm returning to school this fall, I'm even more likely to be restrained myself or to see a black student restrained. And you think, what would be reasonable in this world right now for a child of any age if they were being restrained or saw a black student being restrained? It is completely reasonable for them to think that they are going to die. They watched a video where a black man was murdered with restraint and died in front of them. This is very real to them and reasonable to them. Think of the trauma that was already induced by this practice and how much worse the trauma will be now. I go back to I don't understand the thinking behind this bill. I don't understand how did we get here? How did we support something like this? Who was part of this conversation? You know, and I've heard the things. You know, I've heard the well, it's because teachers we have a lot of teachers and they're upset and we need to give them something. Okay, I heard that. I heard Republicans were going to pass this no matter what, so Democrats, to have any input, needed to support it. Okay, I don't get either one of those things. You don't support racist legislation. You know, here's the bottom line, is that you don't compromise on equity. You don't compromise on equity. You don't negotiate around equity. What I believe our black students and families are asking us to do is to have an understanding about the system that we have created in schools for black students. Why are black students more angry at school than white students? Let's look at some more statistics. Black children are way more likely to be non-proficient readers than white students. 2018, 80% of black fourth graders were non-proficient readers compared to 54% of white students. 87% of black students in 8th grade were non-proficient readers compared to 54% of white students. Whether this is about inadequate instruction, low expectations, implicit bias, not having, the right interventions, the bottom line is we are not teaching black students as effectively as we are teaching white students. And they're angry about it, and they should be. I believe that black students are disciplined for behaviors that white students are not disciplined for way too often. The racism that is so prevalent in our educational system leaves black children and black families feeling dehumanized. And that impacts behavior. Hopelessness, disengagement, fear, not being heard leads to frustration. Very understandable. So how are we going to respond? When we take into account the trauma that has happened this spring for black students, black citizens of this state, how are we going to respond? So I used to have, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I used to have thinking not that long ago that, we need to invite people to the table, right? To our table so that they can have a voice. And I learned, first of all, that it's not our table. And it's not up to us to invite black people to our table. We need to be invited to their table, which is a privilege when we are. And what I've seen, particularly in the last few weeks, is we're being invited, again, a privilege. And we're responding. We're reading books. We're putting things on social media, and we're wearing supportive clothing, and we are going to protests, and we're saying the right things, right? We're ready for self-reflection. I hear that over and over again. I'm ready to look at myself. Now is the time for that. But then somehow we go to the table and we partake, and then somewhere between that table and home we get drawn to another table, right? And maybe we try not to go, but there's things there we like. I don't know, there's nice appetizers or cigars or whatever, something we want. So we go there and we sit at this table of white people. I'm going to call it the table of racism. And we sit at this table and we create bills like this one. And we do this because we lose perspective. We don't have adequate input. We forget all about the table where we were just invited and participated. And we need to make the table of racism a place that we never sit again. Never. I don't care, how much profit we can make. We need to not sit at that table. So what do black Iowans need our legislators to do with this situation? I think we need those legislators, and black families and students and black citizens in this state need those legislators to take the same conviction and the same passion and take their Black Lives Matter garb and that they've been wearing to the protest, and they need to go to the legislative floor, and with that same conviction and with that same compassion, with that same commitment to change, they need to vote no on this bill. They need to show that they are not willing to compromise on equity. If that does not happen, the result of this bill will be even increased trauma for black children and families, Black children will be removed from school at an even higher rate, even though we'll feel okay about it because we're sending them to a therapeutic classroom, which is going to be the, a lovely place for them to be. We're going to put even more Black students in a classroom in another place so they're not in the regular school. We'll have more Black students arrested at school. That is the result. Our reality will not get better and will actually get worse if we don't show some courage and we don't show some willingness to change. We absolutely cannot allow our Black students, Black children of this state and families to come back to school and face a worse reality than when they left in March, with all that has happened and all the support we have promised and all the change we have made a commitment to doing. We cannot turn our backs. We cannot turn our backs. We cannot support racist policies and practices anymore. We have to do better, and that time is now. We have to do better now.